2 years ago today, on October 7th, 2023, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood stormed across the Gaza-Israeli border. The result of this incursion killed 1,200 Israelis, resulted in more than 250 being kidnapped and held hostage. The IDF response in Gaza has by any stretch of the imagination been cataclysmic to the point many consider it genocide. On this podcast, I'm going to look at this conflict through the lens of a very, very simple and straightforward assertion. My goal is to simplify the complex, get over the blame game, with the hope of trying to understand what happened and why, and make a few predictions about what to expect in the near to medium term future. Hello and welcome to the No Hair All Heart podcast. I'm your host, Mookie Spitz. Usually this podcast is dedicated to relationships and emotions. And I thought, therefore, it's fitting that we talk about this horrific event and its aftermath through the lens of compassion, understanding, and, in a sense, the inevitabilities of history. Jared Diamond, in 1997, published a classic in the field of anthropology and history. Guns, Germs, and Steel had a very simple, straightforward thesis. Countries invade other countries based not on the respective genetics or culture of these countries, but on the geography and overall environment of their peoples. Diamond uses the counterfactual to set up his case. Instead of the Spaniards sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and essentially invading and taking over most of South and Central America, he suggests the counterfactual. The Mayans, the Incas getting on boats and invading Europe. Why didn't that happen? Why do people speak Spanish and Portuguese in all of Central and South America? Why is the religion Christianity, Catholicism, instead of Spain and most of Europe worshiping pagan gods, writing cuneiform, and speaking the ancient dialects of the tribes in the Western Hemisphere? That's a very, very interesting idea. We take for granted that history unfolded the way it did, and by answering that question, we reveal the heart of how civilizations evolve and why one is able to conquer another. And again, his thesis is, more specifically, that the land, the topography of Europe and its indigenous flora and fauna and animals precipitated the historic outcome that we assume to be the inevitable product of a superior human culture, perhaps even race. And throughout the book, he goes through example after example as to why the European environment was conducive to the development of guns, germs, and steel. The weapons, the diseases, and the technology, the infrastructure required for Spain to invade South America and populate it instead of the other way around. Now, when you look at the Middle East, specifically Israel and Palestine, I think it's very, very useful to apply a similarly critical and creative lens. Let's start with the land. Israel, in square kilometers, is about the size of New Jersey. 22% of this New Jersey-sized plot of land is Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza and the West Bank are physically separated from each other. The populations of Israelis, inclusive of Jews and Israeli Arabs, and the population of Arabs in Gaza, and the mixed population in the West Bank is super dense in general, with very little distance between these historic adversaries. The land itself has no natural boundaries, no big mountains, no sprawling valleys. It's wide open. The land has very few natural resources, whereas much of the Middle East is oozing in oil. The land of Israel is not. The land is arid, difficult to cultivate. The land is also historic in terms of its importance to all of the three religions, exemplified and focused within the city of Jerusalem. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all turn to Israel as their own promised land. The Jews consider it their historic home. The Christians, especially the evangelical Christians, consider Israel essentially the landing strip for the second coming of Jesus Christ. That might help explain the warm and long relationship between Israel and the evangelicals here in the States. Our current U.S. ambassador to Israel is Mike Huckabee. He is an archetype of this type of evangelical who considers it essential that the United States is closely allied with Israel to, as I'm saying, provide that safe landing place for Jesus. I'm not making it up. Look it up. And Islam, again, considers Jerusalem holy. So you have this amalgamation of factors. When looked through Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel lens, is a mess. Let me summarize. The land is tiny. The populations are relatively large. The populations are intermingled in a way where there are no real natural boundaries between them. The resources, the actual resources, are scant. And the stakes couldn't be higher in terms of the value assigned to this otherwise worthless, tiny, and boundaryless land. That's amazing. And actually, if you think about it, the idea of peace between Israel and Palestine seems intractable. I'm not going to go into the minutiae of the historical conflict. You have the Nakba of the Palestinians, where documented as many as 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes when the Israeli Jews claimed the land as their own. And then you have the Israeli Jews coming out of the Holocaust with the historic claim of the return being the only way to protect the Jews from universal and ubiquitous anti-Semitism, which culminated in mass extermination in Europe. So you have this classic example of an infinite force hitting an immovable body. And again, I'm not going to go into any of the details as to who is right and who is wrong, who has a valid or an invalid claim to this tiny plot of otherwise worthless land. This is just how it rolled. And depending on whether or not you happen to be born Jewish, Jewish Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, that seems to be how your values and how your interpretation of history happens to roll out. It's no different emotionally and perhaps even factually than if you're rooting for the Chicago Cubs because you're a North Side Chicagoan, as opposed to rooting for the Chicago White Sox if you happen to have been born or live on Chicago's South Side. It's ad hoc, it's arbitrary, it's deterministic, it's entirely circumstantial, and aside from that emotional tribal connection, makes absolutely no sense. People know this, but the emotions are so overwhelming and the heart so superseding any efforts of the brain that this intractable war of attrition, this grind from generation to generation, has been nonstop, relentless, and making little to no progress. Due to all these factors, Gaza in the southwestern portion of the country and the West Bank in the northeastern portion of the country, 22% of New Jersey, ostensibly, given these historical parameters and circumstances, are considered Arab, Palestinian Arab, ostensibly. As we know, settlements in the West Bank, which many consider illegal, are nonetheless expanding and have been expanding. In Gaza, essentially left to its own devices, has turned into an open-air prison for its inhabitants. They can't really leave. Everything is monitored, or the attempt is made to monitor what comes in and what comes out. And the Gaza government, led by Hamas, has chosen to turn this open-air prison into an armed enclave with, I believe if you add it all up, hundreds of miles, if not thousands, of underground tunnels, not for the population, but for the fighters, and tens of thousands of imported rockets, many of which were fired at Israel over the course of only a couple hours the morning of October 7th, 2023, let alone incessant random barrages coming from Gaza. Now, once again, I'm not assigning blame. The Israelis say that when they left Gaza, the Palestinians had an opportunity to turn it into what's been called the Riviera of the Middle East. The Palestinians claim that the Israelis have them under siege and they've been actively at war. The West Bank settlers claim the entire West Bank as legitimate Israeli territory and want the Arabs out. And the Arabs in the West Bank are calling foul, saying that this is our territory and you have no business being here and you're in violation of international law, and on and on and on it goes. Now, what's significant historically amid this mess and recent has been the security agreement and negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain. Under the first Trump administration, the decision was made to shift American foreign policy in the region. Instead of adopting this stance of trying to appease all parties, while clearly being unconditionally and unilaterally in support of Israel, I mean, just factually, the United States has put on this show of trying to negotiate peace between the Palestinians and Israel. And in doing so, didn't see an out or an opportunity for Israel to really negotiate and open up real diplomatic relations with the surrounding Arab world. Now, what Trump and his son-in-law Kushner did was to change that foreign policy. Instead of trying to appease everyone, at least on the surface, and annoy everyone in the process, what Trump and Kushner did was, we're going to pick sides. And we're going to do it shamelessly and unabashedly. We will choose the Sunni Arab leadership to ally ourselves with. And that's specifically Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain. We will be friendly with Qatar. We have been for decades anyway. There's a major military base or two in Qatar. Qatar, much like Saudi Arabia, has done a masterful job of playing both sides in a way that has been far more effective for them than the United States, their own realpolitik. But the twist here is to forge an actual security deal between Israel and these Arab states, not Qatar formally, but Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain. And what brought that deal about was as much having a common enemy as common interests, namely Iran and Syria. So the deal took advantage of the centuries, millennia-long divide in the Arab world between the Sunni and Shia factions, if you will, and hooked our wagon to the Sunni top leadership and said, screw it to Syria and Iran, our avowed enemies. Connect up Israel in a diplomatic way with these Sunni leaders. And even though Hamas ostensibly is also Sunni, supported by Qatar, essentially throw the Palestinians under the bus. In other words, peace in the Middle East for decades has been contingent on the Palestinians gaining their two-state solution, or at least taking a few baby steps in that direction. What the security deal did with the first Trump administration was to throw that essentially in the garbage. The Palestinians were marginalized, were left completely out of the negotiations. And what was considered central, foundational to Middle East peace, pursuit of the two-state solution, giving the Palestinians statehood, was essentially taken off the table. Now, Yahya Sinwar, the political and strategic leader of the Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas, in a sort of civil war with his own Palestinian brothers in the West Bank, led by the Palestinian Authority and old and corrupt Mahmoud Abbas, was scheming, receiving funding from Qatar, ostensibly with the okay of Netanyahu, who felt that appeasing Hamas could further the wedge between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and thereby further preclude the possibility of a two-state solution, because you had this internal warm civil war between the Palestinians in the West Bank and those in Gaza. Netanyahu figured, let the Qatar folks openly fund Hamas, turn a blind eye to whatever Hamas was cooking, and play ball a little bit. Consider Hamas frenemy number one right next door. We're actually in your yard, camped out. And Hamas and Sinwar, planning October 7th for quite some time, played ball right back. They were playing nice, limited to no rocket exchanges, conversations, exchange of workers, Palestinians seeking medical treatment. Basically, a chill environment was created to infuse the region with a false sense of calm. And what Sinwar was doing was prepping for October 7th. And his goal was to put the Palestinians back into the mix. October 7th was right at the brink of the next phase of the Israeli-Saudi security deal. The Saudis were set to get a nuclear reactor. Look it up. American technicians were to run the thing, but as a hedge against the Iranian nuclear program, the Saudis had a nuke program on the way as part of this security deal. Again, look this stuff up. And Sinwar knew that if this next phase of the Israeli-Saudi security deal went into gear, the Palestinian people, namely the Palestinians in Gaza, would have even less of a shot of getting what they wanted. Now, what he wanted, and what Hamas has always wanted, to be fair, is the eradication of Israel. When you say from the river to the sea, that means wiping out Israel. There's no ambiguity about this. And if you're a college protester in the quad at Columbia and you're shouting this, you're shouting death to Israel. There's really no difference, but I digress. Anyway, Sinwar wanted the end to Israel, but to get to that point and at least advance Palestinian interests toward what would be considered a two-state solution, he knew he had to act. And I believe, and I'm not the only one, that October 7th, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood or Storm had everything to do with creating enough disruption in the region to shift focus back on the Palestinian plight and their demands, having been marginalized. Now, here's the second part of this strategy. Sinwar knew that for every Israeli Jew murdered or brutalized on October 7th, the IDF would wreak 100x, 1000x retaliation. And this is what I mean by the operation exceeding Sinwar's wildest expectations. A combination of factors came together to make the operation so much more effective than even Sinwar in his wildest dreams would have anticipated. The electronic surveillance along the border, turns out some drones took it out. The Israeli army was distracted with unrest in the West Bank, so the border itself was underprotected. All eyes had shifted to the West Bank, and the Israeli population and military had become passive. They were no longer at their highest alert, as evinced by the response, the failed response. And what started as an incursion, and perhaps a few dozen, maybe 100 Israelis killed, maybe a dozen kidnapped, became an order of magnitude more significant. 1,200 Israelis approximately killed, some through friendly fire, we must add, and about 250 kidnapped and held as hostage, some dead, most alive. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Now, again, the essence of Sinwar's approach was to trigger an overwhelming and disproportionate IDF response, which is exactly what happened. Israel eventually not only bombed, but invaded. And depending on estimates, few argue that less than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed to that 1,200 Israeli lists. And the war continues. So, as of this recording, on the 2-year anniversary, active negotiations are in play for Hamas to release the remaining hostages and remaining hostage bodies, about 20 or so. 1/10 of the original toll from that fateful day. Now, here's how Sinwar's strategy worked. And again, worked beyond his wildest expectations. The world was, in a sense, sympathetic to Israel when they were attacked. The world was aghast and shocked, and people were demanding peace, and were fairly sympathetic to what Israel had just endured. But Israel was quick to respond in their usual disproportionate capacity. So the lion was sleeping, but then the lion woke up and roared and clawed and ravaged through Gaza. And as the fatalities increased, as the level of suffering of Palestinian civilians increased, anti-Israel and anti-Semitic fervor blossomed throughout the world, which was Sinwar's specific intent. Not only did Sinwar put the Palestinians back on the map, front page news, it short-circuited, at least temporarily, the Israeli-Saudi security deal, and it flipped American public opinion, especially for young people, even especially Democrats, liberals, from being sympathetic to Israel or neutral to actively being pro-Palestinian. And now if you look at Pew Research, this status quo, this a priori belief, behavior that America is unilaterally, unconditionally in support of everything Israel does is now gone. And politicians in Washington are reevaluating their stance toward Israel. Sinwar, check, he won that. But what Sinwar did not anticipate was Israel, the lion, rearing its head and roaring with such fervor that not only did the IDF decimate most of Gaza, kill tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, expand settlements in the West Bank, but take out Hezbollah too. This surprised everyone. Sinwar was hoping that Hezbollah would do a sympathetic rocket salvo against northern Israel, and the war would escalate and expand throughout the region. And if Sinwar were really lucky, he would have stirred up a hornet's nest of Arab anger as a result of so much suffering in Gaza, and basically had another 6-day war kind of situation. That did not happen. We heard about the amazing walkie-talkie attacks on Hezbollah leadership, the use of AI and the most concentrated bombardment since World War II on southern Lebanon. And essentially, within a matter of weeks, Hezbollah as a threat in the north was neutralized. Unbelievable. That was Iran's primary proxy. That enabled Iran to wield the puppet strings throughout the region, which was this threat of precision-guided missiles raining down on northern Israel and central Israel. That has been quashed. And then the next phase, an attack on Iran itself. Salvos of ballistic missiles and drones between Israel and Iran in multiple waves, culminating with the Americans under the Trump administration hitting Iran's nuclear installations and doing it with relative impunity. Where's the retaliation? Where's the escalation? None. Zero. The Iranians have been backed into a corner by losing their primary proxy army in the north of Israel, Hezbollah, and by their own systems and military being proven ineffectual against the Israeli military. Wow. So as a result of October 7th, Sinwar did manage to shift public opinion away from Israel, inflame anti-Semitism, turn Israel into an even bigger pariah, and get the Palestinians back on the world stage. Success, success, success. You see those green check boxes. But where Sinwar failed, and a surprise to everyone, I don't see anyone predicting this, Israel managed to, as a result, take out Hezbollah, make the Houthis in Yemen also pretty much irrelevant, and neutralize, at least for now, with America's assistance, not only Iran's air defense systems, but their nuclear program. Wow. Seriously, wow. And all of this is relevant for understanding the current situation with the hostage negotiations and what we can expect in Gaza. Now, a lot of people have been talking about revitalizing the two-state solution. And a lot of folks have been pointing to the potential for peace in the region with an international Arab force managing Gaza, a buffer zone created, which is already in effect between Gaza and Israel, and this hope for a path forward. Now, I am incredibly skeptical, and here's where, up to now, I have been relating what I consider public domain and essentially a shared narrative. And I've tried really hard to remain as objective and impartial as I can. Rather than blaming one side or another, I've done my best to just kind of describe both sides, how it's shaken out, and do so through the lens of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is the Arabs have nowhere to go, the Israelis have nowhere to go, and this kind of simmering conflict seems inevitable because of the sheer topography, geography of the land, and the absurdly compressed locality and concentration of the demographics. Doesn't matter which team you're on, Cubs or White Sox, Boston Red Sox, whether it's football or baseball or hockey or basketball, it's a tribal clusterfuck. And your opinion probably depends on which tribe you happen to be born into and affiliated with, and impressed by the messaging. Also based on your own values and lived experiences and expectations. So it's one big mess. And the mess seems inevitable. One of my more popular pieces on Medium is titled, What Bill Maher Gets Wrong About Israel and Palestine. And I essentially use that argument. I don't call out Jared Diamond, but I've since thought about it in those terms, where you could blame the Palestinians for not accepting their defeat, but they don't, because they technically don't have to, because the land is small, the population is high, and unlike, let's say, the Americans sweeping across the plains of North America, decimating the indigenous population, putting them into isolated camps, you don't have that kind of expanse. If nothing else, the Israelis have tried something similar, but look where it's landed. The Palestinians have refused to give up because they've got leverage thanks to the topography, the geography, the demographics of the region. And when Bill Maher and Sam Harris and the rest of them pontificate that Israel is a first world country, they're democratic, they're not a theocracy with the express goal of destroying Israel. People have rights. You could be LGBTQ in Israel and you can go to a parade instead of being thrown off a rooftop. I get it. I understand this sense of cultural and even moral superiority that goes with that. But it begs the question of the reality that's on the ground. And I'm not going to sit here and judge one culture more superior than the other. I know which culture I would prefer to live amongst and within. I'm not very good at following directions, let alone a theological autocracy, a theocracy based on annihilation, where most of the infrastructure is dedicated to rockets and tunnels and not schools and businesses. I am not a fan of Hamas. I've been blamed as an apologist, and people pile on. I'm a self-loathing Jew for espousing these realities, or I am a frothing at the mouth Zionist for expressing similar opinions from a complementary direction. But all that I'm saying is, regardless of your values, the Palestinians have been resisting for decades because they can, and because they can, they do. And you would too, if put in that position, with those values and with that geography and demographic. That's the key point of this rant, which is an extension of that blog post. And again, I'm not arguing one over the other. I'm merely saying that you can't sit there from the sidelines and judge the behavior of a people based on a value system that you deem superior when the reality of what's going on the ground just isn't it. That's just not going on. What you want is different than what is. And in order to get what you want, at least in part, you need to understand the inevitability of that situation. So there you have the Israeli-Palestinian intractable divide. Now, let's put it in the terms of October 7th, 2025, 2 years to the day after the initial invasion. The hostage negotiations are going on. Hamas has been put up against a wall. Their senior leadership, including Sinwar and his brother, have been killed. The IDF is all over Gaza. And Hamas is basically a guerrilla army, sneaking around, fighting. Part of my complaints about the IDF strategy is that for every Palestinian you kill, you create 10, 100 new Hamas ideologues. Whenever in human history have people changed their minds based on force? Unless you utterly decimate the population. And frankly, the Israelis have been doing that. They've been starving out the Gazans. And I don't want to sidetrack into the genocide definition and attribution, but it's been absurdly cruel. And some would say unnecessary, but it's been necessary in air quotes from the strategy of Netanyahu and his right-wing government. Specifically, they have been focused on the long game. And I think it's very important to understand the mentality here. Netanyahu is kept in power by two folks, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And depending on whose side you're on and what your ideology is, they're either the freedom fighters of Israeli liberation and conquest, or they are Jewish Nazis. You take your pick. I'm not going to go there. I'm merely going to state that we need to listen to what they say and pay attention to what they're doing because they're in power. Only a few years ago, both of these guys were on the internal terrorist list for Israel. Their policies and their opinions were considered so right-wing, extremist, radical not too long ago, and now they're running the government. And they're the ones with the puppet strings. They're the puppet masters of Bibi Netanyahu because they hold the coalition together. And if Smotrich and Ben-Gvir want to, they can force Bibi out of power fast. And Bibi knows this. So Netanyahu has been doing this dance, appeasing the ultra-right wing, and essentially, ideologically, not being too far from them. And the goal of the Israeli right, who are in power right now, is to, and I'll say it as clearly as possible, you don't need to take my word for it. Look this shit up. The goal of the current Israeli government, as dictated by this right-wing coalition in their own words and through their own actions, is the complete annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. Full stop. No ambiguity. They have said it, and their actions dictate it. Look it up for the quotes. Go to ChatGPT. You'll find the video clips translated into any language that you want. You'll notice the interviews and magazine articles. This is not a point that I need to prove to you. The current Israeli government, the folks in charge, want to completely annex the West Bank and Gaza. Specifically, they want all the Palestinians, all of them, out of the West Bank and Gaza. They want to unify all of Israel as a singular, undivided country, and they want to put a final and definitive halt, a forever stop to any semblance of a whiff of the air quote two-state solution. No, forget about it. We're talking about a country the size of New Jersey. Do a Tony Soprano's accent. Forget about it. No Palestinian state. And out with the Arabs. Expel them. Physically remove them from the West Bank and from Gaza. We air quote, put up with Israeli Arabs. They've been more or less assimilated into our society. Most of them are safe. We don't like it. That's the way it kind of is. But the Arabs, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are malignant forces. They are a tumor in Israel and they must be excised. The therapy is heavy-duty chemo. We are starving the population in Gaza, making it so horrible and uncomfortable that they will want to leave, and that the Arab countries who up to now have refused to take them in might think otherwise. As many as we can, they could die. That sounds harsh. It sounds literally like, drumroll please, genocide. Probably because It is. They want the population out of there. And short of attaining this goal, there's no way, and I'll repeat this again, if we're talking about the current Israeli government, let's be real about this. No negotiation toward a two-state solution. To me, when I hear this, it's so patently absurd. Do we forget who is in control of Israel? Are we assuming that Saudi Arabia could put pressure to bring about a Palestinian two-state solution? I did a debate with my good friend Ali on this. It's in another podcast. And I told him straight up that he's smoking crack for even suggesting it. And again, I'm not being partisan. I'm not tribally and instinctively and emotionally wanting one outcome or another. I'm just looking at the facts based on what's being said and what's being done. And this is vitally important when you put it into the framework of the negotiations. Hamas is being pressured to release the hostages from Qatar. Trump wants to win the Nobel Prize. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Sunni side of the street, in terms of that bloc, have a lot to gain from a strong connection to the American president. They've already talked about huge AI chip deals. They have already talked about video game acquisition. MBS in Saudi Arabia has had tremendous foresight to see that Saudi needs to get beyond oil as its primary commodity. And it's got billions, trillions in liquidity to facilitate and encourage their evolution as a country beyond oil. And he's doing it. He's doing a masterful job. They bought the PGA. They're infusing themselves in American entertainment and American business. And AI is where it's at. Someone said that technocratic takeover of Gaza to manage Gaza with an international Arab force and a technocracy. That's just code for the crypto guys creating a solution. Now, the hope of many people is that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich don't get their genocide. That some kind of middle ground can be attained so that the Palestinians can stay, that we can actually rebuild Gaza. But that begs the question of the radicalism that's entrenched within the territory. And that is intolerable to the current Israeli government. So what's going to happen? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they all want to fist pump Donald Trump. They all want the money. They want the investment. They want the technology trading, the media, the entertainment. That's all go code all the way. They've already demonstrated their willingness to throw the Palestinians under the bus, as evinced by the original security deal. And I think what's most important to them is this middle ground right now. They have convinced Hamas, who's up against the law, give back the remaining hostages, and then consider Trump's 20-point plan, which includes disarming themselves. Now put yourself in Hamas's shoes. Are they going to disarm? And even if they agree to disarm, are they really going to disarm? Is Hamas, in any sense, going to capitulate? Will they hand over control to this technocratic international Arab force? And if they ostensibly claim they do, will it be a seamless transition? As part of the 20-point plan, they're given amnesty. So if you're Hamas, no, we won't kill you. At least we claim we won't. And you could pack it up and go into the Sinai like the Jews allegedly did after Egypt. And you could emigrate out of there. So free ticket to ride. Goodbye, terrorists. From the Israeli point of view. Carrot and stick. A lot of carrots here. But they're ideologues. They are as vehement about from the river to the sea as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are annexing the entire territory. I go back to my statement earlier of an infinite force meeting an immovable body. And the 20-point plan is just so damn detailed. The thing that struck me is, how could you initiate a 20-point plan when nothing has worked so far? It's as if like your stereo doesn't work, and then you're working with the repairman to fix it, and he's replacing 20 parts at the same time. How do you keep track? How do you know what's going to work? To me, it just seemed patently absurd that a 20-point plan would be released. Take it one step at a time. Give up the hostages. Okay, that's what they're doing. They haven't agreed to disarm. Even if they agree to disarm, they can lie. Israel has been lying. Everyone's been lying. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is, if the Israeli government doesn't change, if it stays in this form, there's going to be no peace. And if Hamas doesn't pack it up and go, which I can't imagine that they will in any definitive and comprehensive way, you're going to have a continuation of this war of attrition. And yes to rebuilding Gaza, and yes to turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East. But how are you going to force that change in a land that's so small and dense with no natural boundaries, that enforcing it and bringing it about is a multi-generational process? And between now and then, so much can go wrong that I can't see it not going wrong. So I don't mean to shit on the deal, and I want to give credit where credit's due. And I hope the hostages come back and the living ones are reunited with their families, and the dead ones and their families can gain some sense of closure. And I hope that the suffering in Gaza stops, that food gets in, that Gaza can be rebuilt, that there can actually be peace between these two tribes who live so close together with no real boundary, are so compressed, and have been fighting each other for decades. I really hope that this can be worked out. But based on everything I've been ranting about, it seems not only a long shot, but an impossibility. Israel has never been this militarily powerful. Iran is on its heels. Hezbollah is neutralized. The Houthis are no longer a serious threat, if they've ever been, to Israel proper. And the IDF is swarming all over Gaza. And settlements have been expanding in the West Bank like never before. And here's the thing. This is my capper to this rant. The Israeli government and people have never had a more sympathetic and enthusiastic supporter. Trump does not really care about what's going on the ground. I mean, he says he wants to stop the suffering and all this, but he's got the attention span of the ADHD guy that he is. He's transactional, as we all know, and he really just wants that Nobel Prize. And they want to give it to him so they get more business deals. Israel has never had a more sympathetic American president. And Mike Huckabee is literally, as I was mentioning, an evangelical who believes Israel and the Jews are vital to the history of humanity, because when Jesus comes back, Jerusalem needs to be protected so that the second coming could be smooth and maybe even accelerated. He really believes that. He really, really believes that. Look it up. So you have an ambassador from the U.S. to Israel who's an evangelical, who's been tight with the Israelis for decades. He goes to Israel like 10 times a year. He's got deep friendships and relationships in Israel with the Jews there because he is the envoy to Jesus and the Armageddon. And you got Trump, who's very opportunistic, who's playing both sides. He got Netanyahu to apologize to the prime minister of Qatar for bombing the shit out of Doha. Netanyahu did it because Trump told him to. And Netanyahu is now willing to, air quote, negotiate with Hamas because Trump wants him to. Trump wants a Nobel Prize. But Netanyahu knows that a 20-point plan is absurd in its complexity. And every point you add to a plan is a point that could break. It's like a weak chain with weak links. And the longer that weak chain with weak links is, the higher the probability it's going to break. Netanyahu does not need to force failure. He knows that failure is inevitable with this. And similarly, on the other side, Hamas feels the same way. Hamas is like, there's no way this shit's going to work. And the more dead Palestinians, the more the world hates Israel. This was Sinwar's strategy from the beginning. Come in, come and get us, come and flatten Gaza. I know you guys are going to do this. And the world is going to further hate Israel and hate Jews. And we're going to get ourselves ever closer to our goal of from the river to the sea is our ultimate goal, eradicating all of Israel, just like the right-wing Israeli government wants to eradicate all of Gaza and the West Bank. They're similar that way. They're mirror reflections of each other, which is, again, why this can't work. So let's see how far they get. I'm quite certain that the end state here will be more chaos and more suffering, unfortunately. But I'm curious how far the can will be kicked down the road. I'm curious how deep some of these new relationships with odd bedfellows are going to be. I'm curious about that air quote technocratic solution to Gaza, because I'm sure it involves tons of crypto, AI. You know what I see? I can actually see a nuclear reactor and a gigawatt server farm, GPU server farm in Gaza. I'm not kidding. The land in that shitty land is valuable. But here's the question. What to do with the Palestinians? What to do with the Palestinians in Gaza? And what to do with the Palestinians in the West Bank? And for here, I cite the Big Apple in New York City. We used to joke. I moved recently from the Upper West Side to Orange County, California. I was just sick of New York, but I lived in New York for 13 years. And I was wondering, even walking around the place, I'd go to St. Mark's and a lot of these super cool, trendy locations where real estate is now astronomically priced by the square foot, which used to be literal hellholes of crime and vagrancy and drug abuse and prostitution. What happened to the homeless people in New York City? What did they do with them? What did Giuliani do with an entire subpopulation of the citizenry of a city to, air quote, clean it up? And I don't mean to connect Palestinians in any way with, air quote, homeless people, but you see where my analogy is going. You've got thousands, tens of thousands of people who are interfering with your big plans. And the big plans in the 90s was the complete gentrification of Manhattan. Full stop. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. They gentrified Manhattan. New York City became safe and expensive. Every square foot, aside from the remainders of, let's say, Alphabet City on Avenue A and maybe a few blocks in Midtown are blue chip real estate, the whole fucking island. Where did the homeless people go? And as an ancillary observation to that, if there's a will, there's a way. And I think the same rules apply to the West Bank and especially to Gaza. I don't know how it's going to happen. It's probably not going to be nice. But the demographics as they exist right now have to change. And unfortunately for the Palestinians, at least in terms of their goal of statehood, it ain't gonna happen. And not only is the two-state solution, I think, dead in the water, but the very demographics of Gaza are going to be forced to change. Will that mean expelling all the Palestinians? I don't think so. To continue this forced reaction, I was on the Upper West Side. I lived there. There were homeless people camped on my stoop. Another reason I left. And frankly, there are parts of Manhattan that kind of suck, where you try to level the playing field with expensive rents and owned apartments and buildings with subsidized housing. That's why Trump wants to send in the National Guard into these libtard woke cities. I know the analogy is strained, but that's how people look at this. That's how the current power structure looks at this. You have people who are in the way. Honestly, that's the way you have to look at it. Entire populations, ethnicities, groups of people, tribes and tribes within tribes are in the way. And with enough power and money and a lot less time than you think, the power and the money have their way. And I think that's what's going to happen in Gaza and the West Bank. There's an inevitability to it. You can keep fighting the good fight, but eventually it has to give. And what's going to give, and the result we're going to find is not, repeat, not a two-state solution. It will be a unified Israel, not a Palestinian Israel, but an Israel. And just as you have a lot of Israeli Arabs, you're going to have Israeli Palestinians, as it were. You're going to have the vestiges of these populations. But unless there's a radical shift in the Israeli government, which after October 7th does not seem likely for quite some time, the pundits, the talking heads, the reviewers and commentators of history are smoking something funny if they think that a two-state solution is realistic, and if they think that the current Israeli government has anything else on their mind than a complete and total annexation of these territories. And lastly, just as a capper, the entire history leading up to this and the history that's going to unfold, short term to medium to long, has all been predicated by a tiny, worthless piece of land with no natural boundaries, with a compressed, diverse, and intermingled population, with a tortured history, and with religious insanity fueling this entire cauldron of a historical monstrosity. I'm curious what you think. Let's see how this plays out. In the near term, expect hostages to be exchanged. Expect a ton of optimism. The deal is going to fragment and fracture. And again, I'm just curious as to the extent to which progress, air quote, progress will be made toward alleviating the suffering, the terrible suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza and even the West Bank, and the inevitability of the absorption of these territories into the larger state of Israel. Again, thanks for listening. I'm eager for your comments. And let's keep watching the news and see what happens next.